Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. Today I've got a special guest. I've got Michael Cremo, also known as Druta Karmaprabhu. He's the author of the book Forbidden Archeology, along with Richard Thompson. And he's here to talk to us about his work, and I'm going to interview him, and we'll try to go through some of the objections. Mute that. So thanks for coming on. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
I'm most well known for the book Forbidden Archeology, and that is inspired by my commitments to the spiritual tradition of ancient India, which goes under the name Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion. I was born in the United States. My father was a military intelligence officer. And as I was growing up, I was living in a lot of different places. I got exposed to a lot of different worldviews and cultures. And the one that was most interesting to me was the spiritual tradition of India. And eventually I became the disciple of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And as part of my spiritual practice, I study the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, among which are the Puranas, or the histories. And I could see in these histories that they spoke of a human presence on this planet going back much further in time than anything I'd learned from any of my teachers at university or high school. And therefore, I thought that was very interesting. Then in 1984, after I'd been a member of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness for many years, I was a writer. I was writing articles for the movement's periodical, Back to Godhead. And I was also part of a team that was producing books for the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. These were relatively simple books introducing people to the ideas of reincarnation and mantra meditation and other related topics. I was asked in 1984 to work with one of the movement scientists, Richard Thompson, who had a PhD in mathematics and statistics from Cornell University. And we worked together to produce a publication called Origins, which gave a Vedic perspective on all the main topics in science: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness, the origin of species, including the human species. And afterwards, we decided to turn each topic in that relatively short publication into a book. And I was given the archaeology topic to work on. And I did 8 years of research and writing, looking at the whole history of archaeology. And I found that today, most scientists believe that humans like us came into existence between 200 and 300,000 years ago. Whereas in the Puranas, like the Bhagavat Purana or Srimad Bhagavatam, we find information that human populations were existing on Earth many millions of years ago, far longer than the modern theories allow. So we kind of wondered about that. So I looked beyond the textbooks, the current textbooks, into the entire history of archaeology. And I discovered that if you do that, you'll find many reports by professional archaeologists and geologists and other scientists digging into the earth who have published in the professional scientific literature reports of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints going much further back in time than 300,000 years, going back in some cases many millions or even tens of millions of years. So we collected that material in the book Forbidden Archeology. And after the book was published, I began representing the subject matter of the book at professional gatherings of archaeologists, meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, the European Association of Archaeologists, and many others as well.
Cool. So some of your critics level some pretty benign criticisms against you, in my view, one of which is that you're not trained in archaeology.
No, I'm not professionally trained in archaeology, but that hasn't stopped my book, Forbidden Archeology, from being reviewed, sometimes with some positive remarks in the professional archaeological literature. It hasn't stopped me from presenting papers at meetings, as I said, of the professional archaeological societies. You have to give a paper, you have to submit it for review by an academic committee. And if it's not up to their standard of discourse, they won't accept it. But I've had dozens of papers accepted for presentation at professional gatherings of archaeologists. And some of them have been published in academic publications as well. So the fact is that many archaeological societies are willing to accept presentations from people with a serious interest in their topic that can rise to a certain level of discourse. Now, of course, there are those who really don't like that. Fortunately, archaeologists are not all of one type. There's some diversity. There's one group which is committed to a very positivist, reductionist, materialist view of archaeology. They think there's one archaeological science that's objective, it has the truth, and there's no disputing it. No alternatives can be presented, and they're very fixed on that. Those in that group would be very much opposed to me being allowed to make presentations in these professional forums. However, there's another group of archaeologists who I call the Archeology's group, who are more or less committed to the same ideas, but not in an ideological fashion. They're open to hear presentations of alternatives, of contradictory evidence, and give it some consideration. I'm not necessarily saying that they agree with me, but they are willing to listen to a serious presentation of alternatives. Now, if you want to be in the more ideological group that wants to dominate and exploit and control the dialogue and exclude all alternative voices, fine, that's your choice. But not everyone is like that.
I'll play this clip from Christopher Hitchens because I think it'll give us some dialectic context. And I think it's one thing that we have a good answer to, which many Christians don't.
Experiment. This is what you have to believe now, if you're a monotheist. Because we now know things we didn't used to know. We know that the human species could be as much as 200,000 years ago. It becomes separate from the Cro-Magnons and the rival pre-human species. Could be as little as 100. Richard Dawkins thinks 200,000. Francis Collins, who did the Human Genome Project, who's, by the way, C.S. Lewis kind of Christian, thinks 100,000. All right, I'll take 100. I'll take 100. Here's what you have to believe. For 100,000 years, humans are born as a primate species. Expectation of life, what, 25 years for the first few 100,000 years? First few tens of thousands of years. Infant mortality, rife. Microorganism disease, terrifying. Earthquakes, volcanoes, extraordinary. And fights over land, over territory, over food, over women, over tribalism. Frightening too. For 96,000 years, heaven watches this. With folded arms, with indifference, with coldness. And then around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, but only in really barbaric, illiterate parts of the Middle East. Not in China or where people can read or think or do science. No. In barbaric, illiterate, backward parts of the Middle East, it's decided we can't let this go on, we better intervene. And what better way than by human sacrifices and plagues and mass murder? And if that doesn't make them behave morally, we just don't know what does. If there is a single person in this room who can bring themselves to believe...
Anyway, you get the idea. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I'm not going to speak about plagues, but I think everyone can draw their own conclusions. But it's typical. He, of course, would have to reject what most scientists today who are of this materialist school that he represents, most of those scientists today now think humans have been around for 300,000 years. So how does he react to that?
Well, the number doesn't make any difference. I think when you make the number longer, his argument gets more powerful because he's saying now for 300,000 years, humans have been suffering with all sorts of disease and illiteracy, and only, in the last couple thousand years did God finally decide to do something about it and start Christianity.
Is that supposed to solve the problem of birth and death in this world?
Well, I think the argument's relevant because I don't know, I think you might have framed it in a way more relevant for your point elsewhere, but, they say for, millions of years, the cosmos goes on, and then, billions of years the earth goes on, and then hundreds of thousands or millions of years of evolution, and then finally you get humans, and then hundreds of thousands of years of humans until finally Jesus comes along to sort us all out. And here we are thinking we're so special. And, surely if there was a creator, there wouldn't be so much wasted time and wasted space and animal suffering and human suffering before Jesus came along. So your thesis seems to be that there's always been humans and there's always been a purpose for their life.
Yeah, but he's not really addressing that. He's off in his own space dealing with his favorite adversary, the Judeo-Christian. But, it's kind of interesting if you really look at modern science, which grew up in a Judeo-Christian society in Europe, after, the time of the Greeks and the Romans and their pagan mythology, the church, the Judeo-Christian churches, they wiped out that existing so-called pagan worldview. And they introduced their own cosmological concepts. The Romans and the Greeks had a view of time and human origins very much like that of ancient India, the Vedic culture, which involves a cyclical concept of time, with humans and other species appearing again and again and again over vast cycles of time. The Judeo-Christian view of time was linear and progressive. There's one beginning of the universe. God creates all the different species. Finally, God creates Adam and Eve, so the humans come relatively late in the creation process. And then humans gradually become more and more degraded. And finally, Jesus Christ comes, and there's some final judgment and salvation, and it's all over. Everything happens just once. It's really interesting to me how Western science, which grew out of that Judeo-Christian worldview, has the same concepts of time. There's a single creation event, the Big Bang, the origin of the universe. Things evolve. Finally, you get the human beings, like God created Adam and Eve after all the other things were created. And then, they're in a suffering condition, and then they're going to be saved by science. And then finally, there's a salvation event. Yes, we have come to save the ignorant, fallen, sinful people, and eventually we'll download ourselves into computers and be eternal. It's the same story. Sometimes if you take an alternative perspective, like go to a different worldview, like the Chinese or the Indian or the Egyptian, you can see that somebody like Hitchens, he's so close to the people he's criticizing. It's just absolutely amazing how foolish it looks to me anyways.
That's a really interesting point. I never thought about that.
Well, that's what I'm here to do. Tell people about things they haven't thought about yet.
Cool. So your work focuses on human skeletons, human fossils. What about animals and plants?
It's very interesting. I was asked that same question once when I was in Brazil. My books have been translated into 20 or 30 different languages. One of them was Portuguese, which is the language in Brazil. So I was invited there on a lecture tour once, and I spoke at universities all over the country. And one of them was the university in Sao Paulo, which is a huge city in Brazil. They have a big, huge university there. And I was invited by a professor in the history of science department to give a talk in one evening to the faculty and students of that university. So it was in a packed auditorium, and I presented a lecture based on my books, Forbidden Archeology and Human Devolution. And I could see there was one professor sitting in the audience. He had his arms like this, and he was just glaring at me the whole time. And he had brought all his graduate students with him, and he was going to show how you can defeat one of these stupid pseudoscientists. So I gave my talk about the archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. And then I was showing a PowerPoint presentation, different things. And then it was time for questions. And the professor who had invited me, he was running the session. So that guy stands up, he's got his hand up. So the professor who's running the meeting calls on him. He said, "Well, all very good, Mr. Cremo, but it really doesn't affect the theory of evolution, because you haven't mentioned any of the other species at all. You just talked about evidence for very ancient humans. Have you any evidence that, for example, dogs have existed for longer than they're supposed to have existed?" And it just so happened, that generally I don't show all my slides, and when I give a lecture like that. I've got some PowerPoint slides after the end in case different questions come up. So I just recently seen published in Nature a report about some discoveries that paleontologists had made in China. And one of them was pretty amazing. They had discovered in layers that belong to the Cretaceous period, which is the time of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs lived in the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, and the Triassic periods over 65 million years ago and going much further back. So they had thought previously that the only mammals present in the Cretaceous, that period, the time of the dinosaurs, were very small, like about the size of a mouse. But they found in China, as reported in Nature, a very respected scientific journal, the fossil skeleton of a large animal the size of a wolf. It looked like a wolf, a dog, in other words. And it had in its stomach, the stomach area, the bones of a small dinosaur. In other words, this dog-like creature, about the size of a German shepherd, was a mammal, a dog, that was eating small dinosaurs. So I put that slide up and I told him, yeah, well, there is evidence that other plants and animals have existed long before their currently accepted dates. And he was shocked, that I'd answered his question in that way.
Nice.
And he just began yelling and screaming at me. and the professors around him were saying, "Calm down, you're just making him look good." And he finally left with his students. And I was told later that in the parking lot, other students were kind of questioning him, why he was reacting like that.
Nice. So that brings up another point. If I was reading something from Tom Morrow, one of your detractors, if modern humans and ape-like hominids coexist in the distant past, paleontologists will always presume they shared an even earlier ancestry. So even if you do show that dogs and humans were living alongside dinosaurs, can't we just assume that the ancestry goes back even further and evolution is still true?
Yes, you can. And if you want to develop that idea, I'd be happy to see you do it. That would be my answer. One thing I want to make clear, however, is I'm not upset if somebody doesn't agree with me. We can agree to disagree. I know that the views that I'm personally convinced about, that my personal convictions are not shared by most of the people in these disciplines. If we're talking about the ordinary public, I think their ideas, if you've looked at the surveys of what people in the United States and other countries actually believe about human origins and other questions, they're very much in line with mine. But I do admit that within what we could call the established dominant groups in society today in these professions, they don't agree with what I've said. That said, however, and I do respect the right of each individual to draw their own conclusions about these things. It's not that I'm on some crusade, but if people are interested in hearing alternatives, I'll present them. If they take them up, fine. If they don't, well, fine too. I think the problem comes in when dominant groups use government to enforce their views on everyone else. That's where I think we run into big problems when people try to compel others by forceful means to believe something or accept something. I think we have a problem there.
Well, the counter argument to that would be that the lay people are too stupid to understand the science, and they just need to get it spoon fed to them by the experts, who are the only people who know what they're talking about.
Well, see, the problem there is that even within the scientific world, you've got disagreement. Now, you may be able to say, well, today, most scientists believe this or that. But if you look carefully at those, even within those disciplines, there are minority groups of scientists who may have different ideas, and that can't be denied. So the question, I noticed my name is misspelled there. There's not an A in the Cremo.
Let me fix that.
I don't know if that can be fixed.
Yeah, I can fix that.
Yeah, that's the problem, that even within archaeology, there are people with different opinions about different archaeological subjects. And it may be true that, well, a majority accept this. Say you've got the out of Africa idea of evolution, or you have the multi-regional concept of evolution, that humans developed from the hominids or ape men in various different places. Or you have those that think, no, it happened in Africa, and then they spread out all over. Now, the out of Africa people, they're now in the majority in archaeology, but there are archaeologists and anthropologists who accept a different idea. They call multi-regional origin of the human species. So I think the proper thing, even for the uneducated masses, so to speak, is that they should be presented with something like that. Well, today, most scientists believe this, but there are some who think otherwise. And I think in our modern education systems, we're becoming accustomed to the idea of respecting diversity and minority representation. For example, if we're going to have a textbook about religion in New Zealand, for example, or the United States, and the government textbooks only mention Christianity, no mention of Buddhism, no mention of Islam, no mention of Aboriginal or Native American Indian beliefs, people would be outraged. They say, no, you have to have everybody represented proportionally. That they would say that you can't just have textbooks that exclude the alternative views, the other views, even though they may be in the minority. So I think we have to take the same attitude, think even in science. If there actually is some diversity of opinion, even if it's minority, it should be represented in the textbooks.
One of the points I like to make on that topic is, if you have the expert opinion as if it's like the dogmas of science, which everybody's to be taught, then despite there being disagreement among experts, then what you really have is the state being the expert on experts, who gets to decide which experts are the ones that we listen to and which ones are heretics.
Yes, that's the problem.
And I don't know what makes the state qualified to be an expert on experts. Surely to be an expert on experts is quite the qualification.
Well, but I think a lot of times in these types of issues, the government takes the opinion of the leaders of scientific associations and people who are regarded as spokespeople for science. That's that, and within the scientific world, there are hierarchies like that. So, there are really fundamental issues here. There was, there have been philosophers of science and historians of science who've really explored these issues, but we'll go on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that gets a bit into the sociology of science and whatnot. One of the critics' articles I was reading on your work was saying that, you talk about human nature and how human nature is sort of there to, it ends up filtering data to some extent. But this one detractor was arguing that surely if there was loose thinking to be exposed by fellow scientists, then some scientists would expose it, even if only to further their own careers.
And sometimes things like that do happen. But we all do knowledge filtering. We all do it. Like the internet companies, they filter knowledge. They don't just put everything and anything that comes in online. Now they screen all types of things, and we do it as well in our personal dealings. But what the issue is, admitting everybody filters knowledge, but the question is how are you applying the standards? Are you applying them equally across the board to every topic that's under review? Or in the case of evidence that more or less conforms to your views, you're kind of lenient, you'll let things go by, and then for something that's more or less against your worldview, do you apply a very strict standard and dismiss it on grounds that would also cause a reasonable person to dismiss the evidence that they also accept? Sort of like a policeman. For somebody of his own race, he overlooks everything they do. For somebody who may be of a different race or whatever, then any little thing they do, they're arrested, throw the book at them. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Yeah, we all filter knowledge, but are we applying the same standards equally across the board when we do things like that? For example, some of my critics will say, well, that report that you used is old. Archaeology's advanced a lot since the 19th century. And, you have to understand, they really didn't know anything back then. But you look in any archaeology textbook that's used in the universities today by the mainstream authors, and they include lots of discoveries from the 19th century. And if you want to say, well, all evidence that was gathered before midnight on January 1st, 1900 is, it's got like scientific evidence has an expiration date on it. Well, go ahead.
Right, but do it consistently.
Do it consistently.
I like to use the same argument against skeptics and epistemology of religion. So it's quite common for skeptics to claim that religious experiences are not evidence for any kind of religious truth because, we can explain it all based on the brain and there's chemical reactions happening in the brain and that must be the cause of the experience. It's like, okay, so if we can find a chemical reaction going on in my brain when I eat a piece of chocolate cake, does that mean there's no chocolate cake? Like, if experience is not evidence of a spiritual reality, then it's not evidence of a material reality either, for all the same reasons.
Yeah. Who was that? There was a British skeptic in 18th
Hume.
century who's Hume. Yeah. Yeah. He was very famous for rejecting all those things. It says it's better just to reject them than alter our understanding of the laws of physics.
Yeah,
Something
but
like
that's just
that.
circular reasoning, right? It's like we know the laws of physics are
Yeah.
true, therefore, when we see things that don't fit the laws of physics, it's not true.
Yeah.
Well, we know the laws of physics are absolute, rather, I should say. We're not denying the existence of the laws of physics here. But we do deny that they're the only thing that governs reality.
Yeah. So there are arguments like that in a lot of different fields, and I encounter them in the field that I've dealt with the most, which is the archaeological topic. Although I'm interested in all facets of knowledge.
Yeah, my experience in debating skeptics is all you really have to do is hold them to a consistent standard. So whatever epistemology they want to offer, let's apply that consistently and see what the consequences are. And I've always found that I can show that anything that's devastating for theism is equally as devastating for any kind of rational worldview. And
Good.
if they're extreme skeptics and they just get to pragmatism, which is that we can't know if anything's true, all we can know is that we get results by doing these things and we don't get results by doing those things, then we can make an argument based on that for religion. I chant Hare Krishna and follow the practice, and my quality of life has improved over what it was before I was practicing.
So is mine. So we can agree on something.
So, have research methods improved? Is there any substance to that argument that discoveries that are over 100 years old has less weight than recent ones?
It all depends. You have to evaluate each discovery on its own merit. Sometimes in the early history of archaeology, they were using methods that are essentially the same as those used today, but under a different name. But then you could say, all right, but now we're bringing in new methods. We're bringing in radiocarbon dating, which they didn't have, and that's true. But it also introduces new kinds of possibilities for error. They found at one point after they started doing radiocarbon dating that it can yield falsely old or young dates because of contamination of samples with modern carbon-14, which can enter in a lot of different ways just by through groundwater, through organic material, like microorganisms, bacteria infecting bone, things like that. So you get, yes, there are new methods, there are so-called improvements, but a lot of times, in many cases, they just introduce new causes of error. They're not like perfect.
Right. Interesting. Maybe now's a good time to go into a little bit of your evidence. So, is there anything that you might call a smoking gun to expose extreme human antiquity or the knowledge filter? And maybe you want to give a little bit more of a breakdown on what exactly you mean by the knowledge filter, although maybe we've covered it already.
Yeah. Well, one thing I should say is that it all depends upon what you consider evidence. Now, I'm very open in my presentations to the scientific world. Yeah, when I do things like that I personally regard the statements of the Puranas as evidence. But in your world, the scientific world, the statement from the Puranas isn't evidence. For you, evidence is archaeological materials recovered from the layers of the earth that are studied with scientific methodology, and we try to determine its age and what it represents, and we draw our conclusions from that, whatever logical conclusions can be made from that evidence. That's our process. So what I've done in a scientific way is to make a hypothesis. If what the Puranas say about human origins is true, then we should expect to find reports of archaeological evidence that go much further back in time than, say, 300,000 years for a human presence. So for me to test that that hypothesis, my method is to examine archaeological reports from, say, the time of Darwin up to the present very carefully to see if reports consistent with the Puranic picture of extreme human antiquity exist. And my contention is that high quality reports by scientists published in the professional scientific literature do report discoveries that are consistent with the Puranic picture of extreme human antiquity. And as to why those reports aren't considered part of the current understanding of the discipline, I attribute it to what I call knowledge filtration, which is not some satanic conspiracy, by scientists to conceal true evidence, which if people knew about would cause them to lose faith in the world of science and its theories, but rather it's something that historians of science and philosophers of science have understood for a long time, namely that theoretical preconceptions can influence how scientists relate to different categories of evidence that come to their attention. And this is, as I said, it's something that's been discussed by scholars and academics for a long time. So I'm not saying anything really new there. I'm just giving examples of how this process works in archaeology. And to just give an example from the history of archaeology, in the 19th century, gold was discovered in California, and miners came from all over the world to get it. They dug tunnels into the sides of mountains, like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They found human bones and human artifacts and layers of rock that modern geologists consider to be about 50 million years old from the early part of the Eocene period. And these objects came to the attention of Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was a Harvard University trained geologist who worked as the chief government geologist of California. He went to the sites, he began his own investigations, he collected the artifacts, he published a big report about them. It was published by Harvard University in 1880, I believe it was. But these discoveries are no longer mentioned in current archaeological discourse. They're not in the textbooks. And why is that? Well, there was a contemporary of Dr. Whitney. His name was William Holmes. He was a physical anthropologist employed in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And he was more highly placed, you could say, in the scientific hierarchy than Dr. Whitney out in California. And Holmes said, well, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution as we understand it today, then he wouldn't have come to those conclusions. He wouldn't have published that report. In other words, if the facts did not support the dominant theory, in this case, the Darwinian evolutionary theory of human origins, then they shouldn't be spoken about. They should just be cast into oblivion. And basically, that's what happened. But so I think that that is a kind of a paradigmatic case of forbidden archaeology and the process of knowledge filtration that I've talked about. But it kind of goes on right up to the present day. You know, I was just recently seeing a report about an object that was discovered in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania by Mary Leakey. It's a bone point like the head of a spearhead or a harpoon, and it has barbs coming off the sides of the object. You know, like, so if you used it to say spear a fish, then the barbs on this arrowhead or spearhead, it kind of prevent the fish from pulling itself off of the spearhead, because it's got these barbs and the head stays in the fish. You can pull it out of the water. So previously they had thought that this type of weapon or tool was something made only by Homo sapiens, human beings like us. So that would have to be less than 300,000 years ago, according to the current ideas. So this object, however, they believe to be 800,000 years old. So then what did they do? Did they say, oh, now we've got evidence that humans like us existed 800,000 years ago, which I think would be a valid approach to take? No, they don't do that. You know, they're kind of fixed on the idea that humans aren't that old. And therefore, they think, well, Homo erectus, which is the hominin or ape man that they believe existed 800,000 years ago in East Africa, they must have been more culturally advanced than we currently believe. And then you might say, well, if you had human skeletal remains, anatomically modern human skeletal remains that were 800,000 years old or older, maybe you could do that. And such things have been found. I'm going to give you another very modern, very recent example of that. In 2016, archaeologists working at, excuse me, archaeologists working at Olduvai Gorge found a finger bone. It's like this bone here, the little finger, the basal or proximal finger bone at that joint. Excuse me. Yeah, so they these archaeologists, they found a finger bone, and they very carefully measured it. They have ways of measuring things, and then they compared the measurements of this finger bone with the same finger bone found in different species of apes and monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. And they also compared the measurements of this finger bone with the measurements of the finger bones of various hominin species, Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus. And they also compared it with the same finger bone in anatomically modern humans. So in their report, which is published in Nature Communications, a very respected scientific journal, the authors say, well, we've got this bone. Technically it's called the OH86 finger bone. And they say OH86 is anatomically modern human. It fits in the anatomically modern human group, not Homo erectus or ape or monkey. It fits in the modern Homo sapiens group. But we can't call it Homo sapiens because of its geological age, which was 1,800,000 years old. So it's knowledge filtering going on right at the present moment. The scientists, they're looking at something, it's staring them right in the face. This is an anatomically modern human bone. It's in a formation 1,800,000 years old. But we can't call it Homo sapiens because everybody knows Homo sapiens didn't exist at that time. I say, well, why not? So.
But if you do that with every case, then when you go to look,
you never. Yeah. There's no evidence to support it.
Yeah. There could be millions of those, and if every one of them is handled in the same way, as for all we know, there's none.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, sometimes it helps to look at things from a different perspective. Or in any case, I say, let's just keep all of this evidence, say, in mind in the archive. Once I was speaking to, I think it was at the Free University in Amsterdam. I was speaking to a group of students, graduate students of paleontology, archaeology, these related disciplines. And I was saying, let's just keep everything in the archive. Let's not get rid of, there may be some evidence that doesn't make sense today it doesn't appear to fit. But we shouldn't just cast it into oblivion. We should keep it in what we could say the complete archive of evidence, because something that doesn't fit today may fit as time develops and ideas develop over time. So I think that's a good possible way of introducing these things.
I like to compare this kind of confirmation bias to if you're working on a business with a business partner and the person's actually cheating you, but you don't want to believe it. You like the person and you trust them. So every time you see some evidence that this person's cheating you, you just shrug it off until eventually, you're cheated and the whole thing's over. And then when you look back, you think, oh, there were hundreds of ways I could have picked up on this. Why did I not figure out that I was being duped?
There was an interesting psychology experiment done some time ago, but it's relevant. It's been cited by historians of science and philosophers of science many times. In this experiment, the experimenters took a standard deck of cards and they changed some of the cards in the deck. For example, if you have a six of hearts, normally it's red. And you take a four of spades, normally it's black. So they switched the colors. Make the six of hearts black. So some of the cards in the deck were changed. And then the psychologist would show the cards to a subject slowly, one after another. And the subjects would have to identify the card. Oh, this is the ace of spades. This is the king of hearts. This is the seven of diamonds. Then they show them the six of hearts, black. And they go six of spades, it's hearts. But, they say six of spades. And, they just don't catch it. Only one person out of 1,000 or something like that, some incredibly small number of people would actually notice, well, that's something's, they'd notice something's wrong. But it just showed that people see what they're accustomed to see, what they expect to see. They don't see what's actually in front of them. They see what they expect to see. So, according to some historians of science, same principle operates in the world of science, at least some of the time.
One of the things I find is when you talk to skeptics, like they accuse us of having an epistemology where it's not based on empiricism, but it's based on accepting statements from Shastra and from spiritual authorities. But then they're accepting statements from spiritual authorities and they're being rather credulous towards that. I've lost my train of thought where I was going with that. Face.
I see where you're going.
You want to carry it out?
Well, you were pointing out that they're accepting authorities as well. It's not that they go out and verify every scientific fact that they employ in their arguments. They rely on the fact that there is some group that they regard as authoritative that has endorsed these discoveries and reports. And in other words, they have to accept on faith a lot of stuff too, that yes, the experiment was actually carried out as described. Unfortunately, as modern science itself is admitting, there are many cases in which people involved in biological and medical research today have put false things in their publications. It's like a huge problem that they're trying to deal with.
The replication crisis.
Yeah, not even replication, but well, yeah, I see what you mean on that level. If nobody can replicate the result in the paper, that's one thing. But in some cases, people have actually fudged their own data because there's huge amounts of money at stake in biomedical research.
Well, also there's the conceptual. It's hard to separate experience from conception. So our expectations of an experience are kind of critical. I heard David Bentley Hart make a point in one of his books about consciousness that, like, you go to drink a cup of coffee and actually you get wine instead. It's not that you're like, oh, it's not coffee, it's wine. The person spits it out, totally confused, figures out, oh, this is wine, and then they can go and take a second sip, and then they taste it as wine. But when they're expecting coffee and they get wine instead, they can't taste it as wine. The expectation is critical. So in a similar way, when we find evidence or have experiences which don't fit any of our conceptions, it throws us off. And with the deck of cards thing, if they hold the card up long enough, then the person figures out, hang on, that's a black card. That's not right. So in a similar way, if we, like you were suggesting, gather this evidence together and just sit with it and see, well, maybe we'll come up with an explanation for it later, but let's at least sit with it, which is the solution for cognitive dissonance, is to sit with it and be comfortable with ideas that are in tension. Then eventually we might come up with an explanation or a conception which is able to fit the data.
To the satisfaction of some percentage of the people.
But at least we're being intellectually honest if we do it that way.
That's the best policy.
So there, coming back to the plants and animals thing. So you've obviously focused on human skeletons, but you said there is evidence. You gave the dog example. So presumably, if you carried out the same type of investigation you've done for human remains, you would find that plants and animals have also been around for far longer than we're told.
Yeah. And actually, there are millions of species, so...
Because one of the detractors...
There's a lot of work to do for somebody, like sometimes I'm asked that question, but I'm only one person, and I can just report on what I have found, like the grain of rice, you could say.
Well, I find...
You test the... is the rice cooked? Well, you take a grain out, and if it's cooked, it's cooked. If it's not, you have a problem. So that's more or less what I've done, is taken the grain of rice. I picked it because usually they say the case for human evolution is their best documented case for biological evolution. So if that's their best case, and I can cast some doubt on their depiction of that case, then maybe I've made some contribution.
Now, so speaking of casting doubt, a lot of skeptics who are big fans of science will say, what's the value in casting doubt on science? Science is the only thing we have. It's the most reliable method of arriving at knowledge we've got. It's given us medicine, without science, we'd still be doing witch hunts and all sorts of horrors that were going on in the Middle Ages. Science has saved us from all those things.
Who's rejecting science? I'm not rejecting science.
Well, if we're casting doubt on...
I'm accepting one idea. Actually, if you look at the history of science, practically every scientific theory that's ever been proposed in the whole history of science has been shown to be false at some point. It's no longer accepted. There are... and philosophers of science and historians of science have really gone through this in some detail. It's called the negative hypothesis or skeptical hypothesis. If you're going to be a skeptic, why not be a skeptic about science? Why is science immune from skepticism? Are you saying you're immune to skepticism? I'm skeptical of what you say.
Yeah, right. There was a cool clip with Lawrence Krauss and on Stephen Colbert's show, and he's like, I don't believe you. And Lawrence Krauss is like, wait, you should question me. You should doubt. It's like, I do doubt your work. It's like, I was quite amused. He's like, that's why you should read the book. He's like, I'm not going to read the book. Anyway, that was a funny clip.
I mean, a skeptic has no defense, really.
Oh, they'll come up with some argument like the epistemology of science is reliable. So, I mean, as long as we can
Well,
say
what
this.
is the epistemology of science?
Well, I've got one atheist who I have on for debates quite often, and he's always talking about novel testable predictions. And of course, you can't run an entire epistemology on novel testable predictions, because how do you use a novel testable prediction to differentiate between living in the matrix and living in a real world? They're epiphenomenally phenomenologically they're identical. But I find your work interesting because you had a novel testable prediction. You proposed something no one else proposed: extreme human antiquity. You came up with the type of evidence that you would find if the hypothesis were true. You went out and then you found the evidence.
Yeah, well, that's I was playing their game. Yeah, if I went among a group of Vaishnava pundits in India, I could give a statement from the Puranas as evidence for extreme human antiquity. They say, well, Dhruva Maharaj was living during the Swayambhuva Manvantar. He was human. There were plants, there were animals. It's there in Shastra. I can't do that at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress. So I did as I explained, turn it into a hypothesis, find a way to test it, present the results, and see what happens.
So this brings up two points. Well, 2 points on one thing. This epistemology that we as Vaishnavas hold to is criticized. So you've been compared to Christian creationists, or perhaps even younger as creationists, in your epistemological approach, which is accepting scripture. But you've also been complimented for being honest and upfront about your views, whereas a lot of apologists will often squirm and pretend like they don't have this kind of spiritual epistemology and pretend to play the skeptic game. But people have appreciated how you're just upfront about your religious commitments.
Yeah, it kind of takes it off the table as a matter of discussion. I learned that many years ago, or I had some experiences that made me decide to behave in that way. Now, I'm not saying that this is good for everyone, or I'm not meaning to criticize those who don't approach things the exact way that I do. I'm just explaining that for me personally, I found this advantageous in that, once I observed a member of our group speaking to a university audience and not speaking against evolution kind of in a purely scientific manner, and just providing evidence against the theory of evolution. And all the questions that he got were, who are you? What do you represent? What is isn't it a fact that you belong to this movement? And there were no. So I found for myself personally that by putting it out, not trying to conceal it or hide it, put it right out there, it kind of takes that issue off the table. So I just take it into account that this is where my ideas come from, and that's the inspiration for them. But here's another point. Once I was at an archaeological conference, a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists, and I made a presentation to them, talking about the knowledge filter, the evidence for extreme human antiquity that's reported in the scientific literature. And one of the archaeologists asked me, in a respectful, sincere way, what if you could be convinced that every single case that you've mentioned in your book, Forbidden Archaeology, or in all your lectures, what if we could show you, convince you that every single one of those cases doesn't stand up, that it's not acceptable? And I replied, well, that hasn't happened yet. Nobody's been able to convince me that any single or even any large number of cases aren't valid or worthy of consideration. But if it did happen like that, what I would do is I wouldn't change my belief in what the Bhagavad Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam, says about human antiquity, but I might stop trying to represent those ideas among people who only accept scientific evidence. Because that's how I approach these things. I'm presenting a Vedic perspective. I admit that my ideas do come from it, but I'm not asking you to accept them on the basis of the Vedic text. I'm telling you, if what they say is true, then this is what we should expect would be present according to your system of epistemology. This is what should be expected. And then if I can't make any case like that, then all right, I just stop trying to make a case among you for this idea, but I'll keep my own idea for myself.
What would you say to the accusation comparing you to young Earth creationists?
What would they say to the accusation that they're very much like the young Earth creationists as well?
They'd say we have the evidence on our side. We believe in good
To me,
epistemology.
it's very much like the case of in India, the Buddhist and the Vedic worldviews, because Buddhism is more or less the Vedic worldview, but with the idea of God subtracted from it. It maintains the same basic cosmology of, yes, an initial creation of the universe, an evolution with the humans appearing last, a salvation history, one involving God and Jesus, and another involving scientists taking the role of the savior and deliverer of the human race. And finally, some last judgment or death of the universe, destruction of the universe at some point in time. It's very much the same story. But in terms of the creationist, I would say what I have in common with some creationists is I think a case can be made for a supreme conscious intelligent being having something to do with the order and complexity that we see around us. And as far as human beings are concerned, well, whether we think the Earth is a few thousand or a few billion years old, humans have been around for a long, long time.
I've got this clip of Graham Hancock and Michael Shermer where you were mentioned. So I'd like to play that.
I've seen it.
Get your response.
I've seen it.
Probably the audience hasn't.
Scientists do that. They do that. Are you familiar with Michael Cremo's book, Forbidden Archaeology?
I know Michael, yeah.
Okay. So now, and he makes, in my mind, as compelling a case as you do. And for his humans were here tens of millions of years ago. And, his book is, 900 pages long.
Tens of millions?
Yeah, tens of millions, okay? And he's a Hindu. So his idea is, this sort of long recycling and
But what evidence is it based on for tens of millions of years?
I'm not here to defend Michael Cremo or to have a discussion about Michael Cremo. That's not why I'm sitting at this table.
I understand, but my point is that
Michael Cremo is not me.
That's right. So, but there's lots of alternative archaeology. This is where I began. There's lots of alternative archaeology books and
right. But what evidence is there that supports that?
None.
So why are you bringing up that when there's evidence that he's bringing up?
No. Cremo's evidence is similar to his. It's mostly negative evidence that I don't accept the date of this. There is this peculiar sort of footprint-looking thing in the mud.
Cremo refers specifically to the knowledge filter. The most useful thing about that book is the publication of reports, archaeological reports, which are no longer available to the public, which do suggest an alternative point of view. I would say it's a very useful book to read. Beyond that, I have nothing to say about it.
Right.
Anyway, that's about as much as they covered it, I think.
I know both Michael Shermer and Graham Hancock. I think he was quite right. His in alternative archaeology, alternative history, whatever we want to call it, the alternatives to the present mainstream view is varied. Graham Hancock deals with the origin of civilization. The current idea is that civilization began in the Middle Eastern area about 6,000 or 7,000, 8,000 years ago, around there. They would say before that there were only some simple villages, and before that, maybe 10 or 12,000 years ago, there were only primitive hunters and gatherers. So Graham Hancock and other people like him, like Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, and a host of others, are kind of focused on pushing the origin of civilization further back in time than most scientists, archaeologists, historians are now prepared to accept. So they're dealing with the idea that maybe civilization was present 20,000 years ago or 30,000 years. It's an entirely different topic than what I'm dealing with in my work, which is the deep history of the anatomically modern human species going back millions and millions of years. So Graham Hancock is dealing with his topic. He's not Michael Cremo. He's not trying to defend everything that I say, although he did acknowledge that he thought there were two important contributions that the work Forbidden Archaeology contributed, namely lots of reports of archaeological evidence that are no longer very easily available to the modern public, and the knowledge filtration idea. I will say that Graham Hancock wrote a very favorable foreword for my book, The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is an abridged version of Forbidden Archaeology. That's about Forbidden Archaeology is over 900 pages, so Hidden History of the Human Race is condensed. It's all the same cases, but in 300 pages instead of 900.
Is that the one that's on Audible? Because on Audible it's called Forbidden Archaeology, but it's really short.
That must be the Hidden History of the Human Race, which is the shorter version.
Right.
So, but it's the abridged version of Forbidden Archaeology, so it's
I thought that
That's
Michael Sherman made a good point that you have similar kinds of cases to make for your various theses, but I think Graham Hancock's response was a bit disappointing.
I didn't find it. I find, why should he have to defend everything that I say?
No, he might have to defend it, but he could say, yeah, sure, we've got a similar strength of evidence, but I'm not here to defend that. Here's the strength of evidence I'm offering. Yeah, maybe you've got a point.
No, I respect Graham Hancock's decision. I might have said the same thing.
Right, okay.
But
Cool.
but because he's not there to defend my work. That's up to me. And I've gone on Michael Shermer, at least I don't know if he still does, but he used to have his own radio show, and I went to his studio. I think it was somewhere in Pasadena at one of maybe at Caltech or someplace like that. He had a studio, and I went in and I did his show, and we talked about these things. So I'm capable of defending my own ideas. Graham Hancock isn't on that show, Joe Rogan's show. He said, I'm not here. Let's talk about the evidence in my book.
You'll have to go on Joe Rogan one day.
Some people tell me that they're trying to set it up. I mean, I go on the basis of invitations. I've never gone to somebody and say, please have me on your show. If somebody invites me to come on their show, I mean, he obviously knows about me because he was asking, like Michael Shermer brought it up.
I want to try to get Michael Cremo on.
He'll probably regret that someday, because if Joe Rogan does decide to have me on, I'll thank him.
Right.
Thanks, Michael.
Right. I've got another clip to play. So, obviously, you've focused on extreme human antiquity, and you haven't done anything in New Zealand. But New Zealand, actually, few people know, unfortunately, has a hidden history. There was a different race of really white redheads that had a completely different culture that lived here before the Maori. The Maoris record this in their own history, and they were wiped out partially by war with the Maori, because they were a peaceful group, and the Maori were warriors. That they were the only native people that I'm aware of that actually managed to hold their own against the British, and never were defeated by the British. And they were also wiped out by the diseases brought over by the British, which shows that they didn't have the same genealogy as the Westerners that came over, because if they did, then surely they would have had similar immunities. So here's a clip from this documentary called Skeletons in the Closet that shows some of the covered over history in New Zealand. It's just one little thing. I just thought I might as well throw something in there. Try to get some diversity on the show.
Institute. And we went through what I call the discarded history. The historians of today don't recognize. And we came up with this book, The People Before. An amazing event took place in 1874 in Auckland, right in the centre of what is now Auckland City. And workmen were working in a street called Coburg Street, which is now High Street, on the intersection of Wellesley Street, right near, outside, where the present-day art gallery is. Behind the art gallery, of course, is Albert Park.
I drive down that road almost every day for work.
And it's well known by a lot of people that Albert Park was a volcanic vent which extruded lava many, many thousands of years ago. So the workmen were putting in this deep trench. They went down many, many feet. They chipped away through 2 different lava flows, and they had an engineer with them, and he actually did drawings as they went down through the layers, through the clays and the lava. They got below the last lava flow, and lo and behold, there was a blackened tree stump there. Alongside the tree stump was an adze. And they pulled the tree stump out to examine it further because it had been cut. And it was a manuka tree, and it was quite a wide girth. Talking to geologists, there is a variance in the time that they give, but anywhere between 30,000 and 60,000 years is what some geologists say, that those lava flows came out of that vent in Albert Park in the middle of Auckland. So what we have to ask is, who was there cutting manuka tree down that long ago?
According to Wikipedia, humans have only been in New Zealand for roughly 800 years. So there's a whole documentary like that. Maybe I'll throw the links in the description. And if you could help me put links in the description for any papers you've published or anything else that's relevant. Maybe you can help me get Michael Cremo on for an interview one day too.
I haven't spoken to him in a long, long time.
He's probably too famous now. So going through some of the objections that have been raised against your work. So you were talking about, predispositions of scientists to different dates for fossils and so on. If modern scientists are predisposed to recent dates because of their belief in evolution, then wouldn't older scientists have been predisposed to older dates for humans based on the conceptions they had back then?
It's kind of interesting what happened. Actually, when I was first getting into this topic, I was wondering, how did this actually happen? So what happened was, in 1859, Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species. And people started speculating about how that process of evolution by natural selection related to human beings. In The Origin of Species, Darwin didn't directly deal with that question, but people immediately began speculating about human beings evolving from apes or monkeys. And in 1872, Darwin published another book in which he dealt with that topic specifically, and he agreed, yes, human beings probably evolved from apes and monkeys. So scientists in Europe and around the world began looking for fossil evidence of intermediates between ancient apes and monkeys and modern humans. But what they were finding was not evidence for some missing link, some intermediate species between apes and monkeys. They were finding throughout the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, they were finding evidence for extreme human antiquity. They were finding evidence that humans existed in what's called the Pliocene and the Miocene, very ancient periods of time that, according to the modern dating methods, go back 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million years. And they were reporting it in scientific publications. And the reason they were able to do that, I believe, was because the timeline for human evolution had not been fixed in the mainstream scientific community at that time. But in 1894, that changed because the Dutch researcher Eugene Dubois had gone to Indonesia, which was at that time ruled by the Netherlands during the colonial period. So he was able to go, being Dutch, he was able to go there and get a position in the Dutch colonial government that allowed him to do research, do excavations, he was specifically looking for an intermediate between ancient apes and modern humans. And he found something at a place called Trinil in Java. He found a skull cap that was rather ape-like in its form. And he also found in the same layer in his excavation a thigh bone or femur that looked like it was sort of human-like, but it looked like it belonged to the skull cap that was found about 15 meters away in the same formation. So he put the two together and said, this is Pithecanthropus erectus, the Java ape man with the ape-like head, but still was able to stand erect. He said, this is our intermediate. And this over the course of a few years became accepted in the world of science. And this discovery of Pithecanthropus erectus was made in formations less than 1 million years old. So now they had a very firm timeline. Okay, if we've got the intermediate at, let's say, about 1 million years old, that means anatomically modern humans have to come after that point. And then it became a problem. Well, what are we going to do with all this evidence that's accumulated over the 1870s, 80s, 90s that shows this very ancient human presence? Well, that all gets thrown out. And then anytime after the Java man, Pithecanthropus erectus discoveries, anytime after that a scientist would discover something that looked like it showed a human presence older than 1 million years or so, would have to be dismissed. Couldn't be true. Because if you've got the intermediate at less than 1 million years, you can't have the modern humans any earlier than that. So then when any scientist, throughout the 20th century and the 21st century would discover anything that looked human that was very old, they'd refuse to recognize it as such. And I've given a couple of examples of that. Or they would have to say, that's a mistake, something's wrong with it, we can't deal with it. So that's the history of preconceptions that I've been able to uncover in my work.
Right. That's interesting. Another objection that was raised is if scientists are unreliable, they're filtering data and so on, so we can't trust the story that's told in the scientific literature. But you're suggesting that we should accept findings that lay people have presented, like a lay person finds a skeleton in a cave or is mining and finds something. So if scientists are unreliable, then it would follow that lay people are unreliable. So your evidence would also fall off the cart.
That is a mischaracterization of what I've actually said. I told you just a few moments ago, we all do knowledge filtration. It's a question of, are we applying the standards equally? Like, we mentioned, first a lay person finds a skeleton. Many of the reports that are accepted today involve discoveries that were initially made by lay people, where scientists were brought in later to verify what they have found. And I'm not proposing anything different than that. Say you take the Heidelberg jaw, which was discovered in Germany, I think at the early part of the 20th century. It was the discovery originally made by workers in a quarry. Scientists were brought in, and today it's in all the textbooks as the primary primary fossil representative of Homo heidelbergensis, which is in every textbook. So if you're going to apply the standard equally, then you'd have to get rid of the evidence for Homo heidelbergensis. So it's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying, oh, scientists do knowledge filtration, therefore they're bad. Therefore, ordinary people, everything they say is also bad. That's not what I'm saying. It's a misrepresentation. I'm saying we all do knowledge filtering. The question is, are we being open what our biases might be? And if we're applying certain standards, are we applying them across the board?
That brings up an interesting point I was meaning to mention, that you find a disparity between popular atheists' attitude on epistemology of religion and the attitude of professional philosophers. Because in philosophy, one thing they do is weed out inconsistencies in their thinking. Whereas, I mean, a lot of scientists don't get trained in philosophy, which is kind of sad, but especially popular atheists aren't trained in philosophy. And therefore, there's not this emphasis on applying things consistently, which can be a lot of work and can be disappointing, because it's like, oh, I've got this brilliant defeater for this competing worldview, and I can defeat their worldview, which means my worldview stands. And if you aren't thinking consistently, you go ahead, defeat their worldview, and your view stands. But often what you'll find is if you apply your defeater consistently and look for parallel versions of that same logic to see what they do to your own worldview, you might run into problems, which is why professional atheists such as Graham Oppy and many others will think that there's lots of perfectly reasonable theistic epistemologies. So I had him on my channel a few weeks ago for a discussion, and he said, yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfectly respectable and rational worldview and epistemology. I'm just not personally convinced by it. Whereas you get Matt Dillahunty and so on, and they won't say that.
Okay, I have to step away. The sun has now come in the window and it's shining on me. So I'm going to step away and take care of that.
Cool. I'll do a quick ad. I've got David Bentley Hart on next week. We're going to be talking about perennialism and probably about the skeptics of atheism as well. David Bentley Hart is quite a well-known Christian theologian. It should be good. Just advertising having David Bentley Hart on next week. So did you want to respond to what I just said? Or should we move on?
Well, I'm not a trained philosopher either, but what you said sounded fine to me.
Yeah, it's the same phenomenon you were describing about consistency. Whatever your epistemology is, apply it consistently and we're good.
That appears to be pretty much supporting what I was saying. So thanks.
What else have I got here? So one thing you've been accused of is conflating possibility with truth. It's possible humans lived a longer time ago, therefore it's true. I don't think that's quite what you're saying.
Well, it's interesting because most of the published objections to my work involve suggestions of possibility. So I agree, that's a valid argument, and I think it can be turned against many of my critics in the scientific world. Like, the reason they object, many of them, to say, okay, I report a discovery where a professional geologist was conducting an excavation and he found a human skeleton in some layers of rock that, according to modern science, are from the Pliocene period, maybe 4 million years old, and you've got anatomically modern human bones there. I mean, specifically, I'm talking about the case at Castenedolo, Italy, the discoveries made by an Italian geologist named Giuseppe Ragazzoni. They'll say, well, it could have been a burial, an intrusive burial. It could have slipped down through a crack, a fissure. It could have been a mistake that, in other words, give possibilities and take it that that's because it's possible something could have been a hoax or a mistake or could be explained away. That means it must be unreliable or any one of those things. So, I mean, I had an experience like that in Moscow at the Russian Academy of Sciences, where I was invited to speak at the Russian Academy of Sciences to their Department of Anthropology. And, I gave a presentation on forbidden archaeology, evidence for extreme human antiquity. And during the question session, one of the anthropologists or archaeologists that had listened to the talk said, "I haven't read your book, but I'm sure that everything in it is a mistake, an illusion, or a hoax." So I said, well, at least you could read the book before you draw that conclusion. And another time I was in Copenhagen in Denmark. I was giving a lecture and an archaeologist from the university was there. And he began to give a litany of possibilities how something could be wrong. You've presented this report, but about, like Dr. Ragazzoni and his discovery, but don't you realize it's possible that could be an intrusive burial? Don't you realize it's possible it could have slipped down through a fissure? Don't you realize there could have been earth movements since then? And I said to him, don't you realize you could be a 3D holographic projection from Mars? I mean, if you're going to proceed in a scientific way, then you have to show scientifically that in this case, at that specific location, there is a fissure that goes from the surface down to the layer in which the human skeletal remains were found, and that there is or was a source of human bones at the level at the top of the fissure. If you're going to proceed in a scientific way, that's what you have to do. Otherwise, what you're doing is just like, a parent trying to keep a child from opening a door where the Christmas presents are hidden. You better not go open that door, because if you do, there may be a ghost or something in there. It's like, so I would have to agree with the skeptics on that. If that was what I was doing, just suggesting because of the possibility it must be, if that's my only reason for suggesting extreme human antiquity is the possibility, then I wouldn't accept it either.
We could argue, like Prabhupada did, that they must have just cremated all the bodies, and that's why we don't find human remains. If you were just going to argue based on possibility, that's a perfectly plausible argument.
Yeah.
So to get onto something more juicy, now I'm in New Zealand, and apparently you were once contacted by someone who had some giant human skeletons. Could you say something about that?
Well, I was thinking about that. I'm a little hesitant because it happened around 1995 or 96, shortly after my book, The Hidden History of the Human Race, was published. And in the course of migrating from computer to computer and everything like that over 30 years or so, 25 years, the original files have been made inaccessible somehow. I don't have them anymore. But basically the account was, I hesitate to do it on a show like yours where there's a big emphasis on factuality. But I will say, when the book Hidden History of the Human Race was first published, and I was speaking about it on radio and television shows that I guess are accessible to people around the world. Somebody in New Zealand, a gentleman in New Zealand, a businessman, got in touch with me and said, would you like to come to New Zealand? Because I can arrange for you to do some interviews and talks in this country if you wanted to come. So I said, I'll be happy to do that. So I flew into Auckland, and this gentleman met me, and he said to me at that time, tomorrow we're going to see something very interesting. A friend of mine is on the staff of the Museum of Natural History in New Zealand. And if you're listening, Mr. Businessman, whoever you were, like I said, I've lost somehow or other electronically, haven't been able to save your messages. They're not accessible to me. So if you want to identify yourself, I'd be happy to hear from you. But he told me a friend of his from childhood was on the staff of the Museum of Natural History in Auckland. And he was going to show us the skeleton of a Pacific Islander. This was from some Pacific island, a human skeleton 10 feet tall. So I thought, okay, I've heard of these things, but I've never been actually able to trace any of them down. So, all right, this is fantastic. So the next morning, we went to the Auckland Museum of Natural History, and his friend from childhood met him and started showing us around the museum. Here's the dinosaurs, here's this, here's that. We asked him finally, but what about the large size human skeleton? He said, I'm sorry, we can't see that today. So I just had to wonder, you got these two very respectable gentlemen, friends from childhood in New Zealand, and something's gone wrong here. But we were talking to the man, and something else had come to my attention, that in New Zealand, they had made an archaeological discovery that showed some type of person had been present in New Zealand about 50,000 years ago. There was a settlement of people 50,000 years ago in New Zealand, but the government ministry had embargoed the archaeological reports. So I mentioned that to the man who worked in the museum. And he said, yeah, that's a fact. They embargoed it. They shouldn't have done that because now people think they're covering something up.
Right. But it's a similar story, though. New Zealand has a history that's like the textbook history, and then any archaeology that doesn't fit that is just papered over.
Yeah, so it's so what you were going to say, I had an encounter about giants in New Zealand. That's a fact, but I just wish I was able to somehow or other find the gentleman who invited me. Like I said, it was in around 1996 or 97, somewhere.
Right, yeah, a long time ago. Back to the Castenedolo burials, I was reading some of your critics, and one of them was saying that those skeletons were considered recent burials based on them being tested and the bones not being impregnated with salt, unlike the other bones found there, which were impregnated with salt.
I've written some things in direct reply to that. I'll see if I can recall exactly what I said. It is a fact that the Castenedolo bones, some of them, were dated by the radiocarbon method. And we got in touch with the scientists who had done the dating. This is during the process of researching and writing Forbidden Archeology, which was published in 1993. During the research phase, which would be a few years before that, we got in touch with the scientists, British scientists, who had actually done the dating. And we asked about the methodology that he used, which was the dates. The year that he actually did the dates was in the 1960s, when radiocarbon dating was still in its very beginning stages. And we asked him, well, what method did you use? And we asked him specifically, did you take into account the possibility of contamination with recent carbon-14? In other words, did you employ specific processes to remove from the sample any extraneous material, radiocarbon datable material? And he said, no, but I still believe in the date, which was around 10,000 years. So that's another fact that has to be concerned. And as far as the salt bones having no salt, that involved a completely different discovery that had been made later on at Castenedolo, and not in the same place exactly.
Oh, okay.
So that more recent discovery of bones, that were discovered 20 or 30 years later and near Castenedolo, but not exactly at the site that Ragazzoni had excavated. They had found some other bones, and the fact that they didn't have any salt incrustations, as the other bones reportedly did have, that's why the scientist who made that discovery thought it invalidated everything that had come before. So all these things are actually dealt with in the book itself as was published. So readers will just have to, if they're really interested in it, they'll just have to go through the accounts. And basically, in Forbidden Archeology, I didn't just present the case for extreme human antiquity. The research that I did was very thorough. I put in also the views of the skeptics and those who argued against. And I present all of that evidence, positive and negative, and leave it up to the reader to decide himself or herself what she or he thinks.
Cool. Thanks for that. So we should probably wrap it up soon, but maybe we can cover one last topic about Sasquatch and Yetis and such.
Sure.
So, there's the argument to make for it, but first of all, one of your detractors said that any kind of explanation of, a Yeti or so on, or, the Loch Ness Monster is best explained by folklore. What would you say to that?
Just because something is mentioned in folklore doesn't mean it's not true.
One of the arguments I'd like to develop or see developed is the similarity between folklore. So if you look at Egyptian culture and different cultures around the world, and you look at the histories, like that, how many thousand years back. The Egyptian kings are said to have lived for 800 years, 900 years. In India, they were saying the same thing. People were living for hundreds of years. So it'd be interesting to do a comparative study of oral history, like native histories, and to see how much the claims of the supernatural and the links people live and the folklore has in common.
I've actually done a little of research like that. In my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory, I have a chapter on the cross-cultural study of cosmologies where I took 40 or 50 different cosmologies of different peoples who lived in different times and places over the past few thousand years, and did a comparative study. And they tend to have, as you were mentioning, similar features. For example, among the Australian Aboriginal people, they have accounts of celestial bodies smashing into the earth. And all over Australia, there are impact craters left from comets and meteors that have struck Australia. And some of them are quite old, going back hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And the people living in the neighborhoods of these impact craters, which are still visible today, have in their traditions accounts of stars or other celestial objects falling from the sky and striking the earth in the areas that they were familiar with. So that could be one dating method.
Right.
If you've got among tribal people in Australia memories recorded in their traditions of a celestial object falling from the sky and striking the earth, and you've got a cosmic cosmic impact crater in the homeland of those people that they would be familiar with, that's say 300,000 years old. You have to ask yourself, well, how did that specific thing get in their tradition, their lore that they've handed down from generation to generation? It seems like it's possible there may have been humans present 300,000 years ago when that cosmic impact was made, and they observed it, and it's remained part of their traditions.
Right. So you're looking at it from the point of view of establishing human antiquity. I was thinking of,
Well, that's a side point. It's
yeah, I was
not necessarily the point that you were making.
well, that's interesting too. But I was thinking of from the point of view of showing that people used to live a longer time, like like the Yugas, things were different back then. The demigods were coming down. That's why the Greeks talk about it. That's why the Indians talk about it. That's why the Egyptians talk about it.
No, I think that's a very good point. That a lot of these different traditions, whether it's the biblical tradition, it also speaks of Noah and other of the patriarchs living for 900 or 1,000 years. The Vedic literature speaking of people living for 1,000 years, and the Dwapara Yuga, and you mentioned some other ones. So I think that is a source of knowledge that can contribute to our understanding of our variegated human past.
Right. So back to the cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown creatures. What's the actual argument you make? Because it seems like some of your detractors don't really understand the argument you make based on those.
Well, it's not the most essential part of the argument, but it is there in the book. The idea is that if one looks at the actual pattern of archaeological evidence, what emerges from it is not a picture of the evolution by natural selection of, you start with apes and monkeys, they gradually transform into hominins, different kinds of ape men, transitional creatures like Australopithecus, Homo habilis. I mean, you see the imagery all over, on people's T-shirts and in museums, the little ape man kind of bent over, gradually becoming more erect and bigger until finally you've got humans like us. If you actually look at the entire archaeological record, what emerges is not a picture of evolution of one form to another. You get a picture of coexistence of anatomically modern humans with different types of ape man-like creatures and apes and monkeys. And the point of bringing in this evidence for the existence or possible existence of living ape men, in other words, beings of the Sasquatch type, the Yeti type, and so on, is to show that that basic pattern of coexistence it goes on into the present day. That today there are humans, there are apes and monkeys. There are also beings that appear to correspond to the so-called evolutionary intermediates of the anatomically modern human type. So the point of bringing in that evidence was to just support the idea that if you actually look at everything and don't unfairly filter things out, what you get is a picture not of an evolutionary transformation of the physical form of apes and monkeys to human beings. Rather, you get a picture of the coexistence of apes, ape men, and anatomically modern humans going very far back in time.
Right. Okay. I guess we'll wrap it up there. Is there any other points you'd like to make?
No, just that if people want to learn more about my work, they could go to my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. There are some offers for my books there, upcoming interviews. If we ever get back to public lectures, we'll have some announcements of those. So, yeah, people go to my website. That'd be good.
I'll put the link down in the description. And you got Facebook too, right?
Yes. And Twitter.
Okay, cool. I'll put those links in the description. Thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Arjun. I really appreciate it. It's an honor and a pleasure.
And next week, I've got David Bentley Hart on. He's a really intelligent Christian theologian who takes issue with some of the same things that we Hare Krishnas take issue with about Christian theology. So he's got a more coherent version of Christianity. He accepts inclusivism, and we're going to be discussing some of the theological issues with Christianity, with exclusivism, and we'll also see where we disagree with one another. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and let us know what you think down in the comments. Hare Krishna.